everybody. This is Dr. Dominic Corva. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Cannabis and Social Policy. And I'm here to moderate a panel tonight on cannabis and spirituality. And ask Sunil to populate and curate it. And Dr. Sunil Aggarwal is my dear friend and co-founder of CASP. So it's a special pleasure for me to moderate this panel with him on it and the people he has chosen. Monte Levine and Salimeh Tabrizi.
I've been using marijuana, 50 years. It's been a really good medicine for me when I've lived in urban areas. It sure helped me survive living in New York. I began to grow extra in 1985 to supply people that were living with AIDS, and have had an adventure since then that required me to have a spiritual grounding.
Thank you, Monty. Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Sunil. It's really an honor to be here. I know I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, not only on this panel, but also the people who have represented this plant and have fought for this plant for decades and centuries when we go back further back into the ancient uses. I'm Salimeh Tabrizi. Currently, I'm a psychedelic entheogen integration therapist. I work in ayahuasca ceremonies, supporting people inside and outside of the sacred spaces, and I also have a practice with the other plant medicines as well, and they've of course helped me tremendously through my own life with my own traumas and breakthroughs, and I also have had the honor to hold the space for cannabis in a conference setting from 2015 to 2018 in Vancouver at the Cannabis Hemp Conference, where the three lines of spirituality, science, as well as environmental sustainability came together. And it's again a pleasure to be with you all.
Good evening or good morning, whenever this is going to air. I'm Sunil Aggarwal. I want to thank Hempfest for giving us this chance to do this panel this year. And I want to thank Yvonne and all the speakers, jury folks for helping us organize this. So for our live studio audience, who are here also, and appreciate you all being here. So my training, I come at this as a medical doctor. I'm trained in allopathic Western medicine at the University of Washington, but I've always had an interest in what we used to call complementary and alternative medicine, now called complementary and integrative healthcare, and I've always been interested to see the value of mixing different medical systems, that offering the best of all possible healthcare systems or medical sciences that have developed around the world. And with different lenses. I'm also trained as a medical geographer, so I'm very interested in the human-environment relationship as it applies to health and disease, to access to care, and kind of a deeper understanding of space, place, and environment, and how that shapes what we consider what makes us healthy and what makes us sick. And public health is kind of the area of medicine that I think, or social science, where Dominic and I have really crossed paths on over the years, and we've given talks at the School of Public Health at the University of Washington, a global health department, other large seminars trying to kind of unpack and open up what does it mean to be what is a public program of health, and when is the public health program perverted to serve aims of other aims where the to justify war or to justify oppression. So I'm very interested in those health justice issues, and cannabis medicine is certainly something that I've practiced, I've studied, and utilized to this day in my clinic, which I started a clinic in Seattle 2 years ago with my partner, Dr. Stan, just called the Ames Institute. And we do a lot of integration of cannabis-based medicine into that practice, educate patients, and try to collect research to find out how cannabis helps them heal. We also utilize psychedelic therapy. The legal psychedelic that's available in above ground medicine right now in the United States is ketamine. And so I've had a chance to, over the last couple of years, treat patients with psychedelic doses of ketamine to help them heal from pain, trauma, depression, anxiety, and it's really opened up a little bit more of a deeper appreciation for me of the role of spirituality in health. And that's kind of what I'm interested in talking about in this panel. And cannabis is certainly the mother plant that brings us together, but it's certainly a gateway to these other medicine plants and fungi that have been called entheogens. And so I look forward to talking more about that.
Fantastic. Well, then that leads me right into, my first question, which is, what is the connection between cannabis spirituality and health, physical health? And I throw that obviously at you, but I also invite our other panelists to weigh in as well.
Sure. Then I'll start. I think the first thing to say, I like to give some definitions of spirituality so we're all on the same page. So a lot of these terms are used by a lot of different people, and it's important that we kind of have an idea of what we're talking about. So, and in my field, palliative care, I've specialized a lot of my work in care of terminally ill or seriously ill patients. Spirituality, spiritual health and well-being is so critical that people all had to agree on a definition, because we all have to provide this care. Chaplains, doctors, nurses, everyone who's taking care of patients who receive palliative care. And so this group came up with a definition, which I really liked in 2009. And they said that spirituality is the aspect of humanity that refers to the way individuals seek and express meaning and purpose, and the way they experience their connectedness to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, and to the significant or sacred. So that is a kind of a broad definition that goes beyond religion, and it's about meaning. It's philosophical, it's existential. It tells us about how we connect to the things that are meaningful to us. And that's what spirituality is about. It's an aspect of humanity. And so spiritual health is a kind of a related concept. It's like a state of being. If you have spiritual well-being, it's a state of being where an individual is able to deal with day-to-day life in a manner which leads to the realization of one's full potential, meaning and purpose of life, and happiness from within. These are just some definitions that I've had a chance to look at in the literature, and I think they really help me understand that health is more than just physical, mental, social well-being. It's also spiritual well-being. And it's not the WHO has this definition. They say it's not just the absence of disease or infirmity. You have to have a complete dynamic state of well-being in the realms of physical, mental, spiritual, and social. And so I think cannabis, because of its, first of all, cannabis is a plant that has been revered for centuries in numerous religious traditions as a substance that can induce awe or inspiration, because it helps promote inner peace, heighten the awareness of the present moment, and aid in meditation to attune a partaker to a higher self-consciousness. And that's kind of that. So we know cannabis is tied into spirituality because humans have been writing about that for so many centuries, and then those of us who use cannabis and recognize some of the interactions to be tied into their spiritual practices or spiritual insights. What's interesting is that, and this is a claim I want to make, is that spirituality, people might be using cannabis not as any kind of religion, but they might be using it in a manner consistent with spiritual intents, or the spiritually related concept of freely exercising sovereignty over your consciousness. And so recreational cannabis which recreation means to recreate or renew. It might be better understood under this wider category of spiritual well-being related use. And then the same thing is that medical use of cannabis for health, well-being, and fulfillment of hope in the face of existential threats. So if you face a cancer diagnosis, if you face a diagnosis or a condition that's going to take you out of the field of your what you do for your livelihood, what makes your function, that's an existential threat to your survival and well-being. And so use of cannabis to help deal with that is kind of a spiritual dimension to the medical issue. So I'm kind of trying to weave the spiritual into these different domains of recreational and medical, and I think so that's how I think it ties into spirituality and health. What do you guys think?
I can jump in. Yeah, beautifully shared, Sunil. And I feel that we can all agree that this is a special time in the human evolution for all of us, and more of our journey is becoming a unified journey. And I think for a long time, the medical or mental health condition for humans was compartmentalized. You go and see a doctor and they say, what is your symptom? The doctor doesn't say, how are you feeling about your journey of life? And like Sunil said, what is your purpose today? Have you dove a little bit deeper into your purpose? And now more than ever, it feels like these questions are coming up to the surface. And I feel like cannabis, at least for me in my life, and a lot of my answers today are going to be subjective, so please just take whatever resonates. But at least in my life, cannabis has been that point of entry into those questions. Whereas, when I take cannabis, I've shared this before, it's a huge mental purge, just like when in ayahuasca, it's a physical purge. That oftentimes happens with the emotions and the spirit, but for cannabis, for me, it's a lot of times the mental purge. It's so much of those thoughts that are going on in my head that I don't have space for, maybe during my day-to-day. And during that time of taking the container and opening the sacrament using the sacrament, opening the container, that I'm able to have a bit more space to think about those thoughts and purge the negative ones until the moment where, like Sunil was saying, where I can come to that present moment. And for me, this is spirituality. It's not even just love or connection. It's even beyond those moments where it's just the nothingness. And so in that nothingness, the body heals. We know that from the studies, the fMRI studies with Buddhist meditators who have done it for so long. We can see what happens to the parasympathetic system, the relaxation in the body, what happens with the breath when we come into that moment of stillness where there's hardly any thoughts, or at least the awareness that we are not the thoughts and the letting go of the thoughts. So it's just so wonderful to have access to this sacred plant that allows us to just drop in to the present, to be able to heal from the source.
So I want to be clear, Salimeh, are you talking about meditation?
Absolutely. The practice of noticing breath and being in the present moment and watching thoughts pass without attaching to the thoughts, and really coming into that place of full acceptance. But there are two, I'm glad you're asking this, because oftentimes, especially in the Western world, when we don't have a Sangha, like a community, to hold us in this, when we're all kind of in this individualistic culture, when we try to sit in meditation, oftentimes there's so much anxiety within us as well that we oftentimes have a hard time in practice. And so for me, cannabis has been an incredible tool for meditation, for access into those spaces, because it does create a level of safety, and, like I mentioned, a level of a purge. So the first layer of maybe the surface thoughts can be purged for more of that stillness and presence to naturally come about. So a huge aid in meditation.
So Monte, I'd love for you to weigh in, and especially I'd like to hear about the connection with hospice care, the provision of cannabis in hospice care. I mean, for end of life, it seems like the spirituality aspect would be very strong.
As far as learning, getting a deeper spirituality, working with people at the end of life, I think that I have gotten more than they have. It's been able to be a shared experience sometimes, and I think cannabis has helped that. But also, I was wondering about what Timothy Leary said about drug set and setting in relation to cannabis, marijuana. How do we change that for people? How to, people are not realizing that very quickly.
Can I ask you to maybe describe that sharing, I guess, shared experience with people? We're talking about people and the use of cannabis to help them, come to terms with, their end. It must have been very powerful.
Yes, it is.
To help with their fear of dying.
That depends on the individual. It's who's around them is a huge piece of how they are. If there's conflict around them, which is often the case at that time of life. I've had really weird experiences. I went to a lecture, and somebody described what it was like to die by drowning. And the day before, I had a dream about drowning, being in a submarine with a window, and to realize that was a dream about dying, it wasn't an unpleasant experience. The best thing you can do is be there with somebody and just be there. Another human presence, without words, with words, depends, is what's needed. And
existential connection.
Huh?
Existential connection. That they weren't alone.
Right. Yeah, I've also done a lot of entheogens over the years. Excessive amounts in the late 60s and early 70s. And I think that had a definite way of shaping who I am today. I think without those, I would have been a really screwed up, fucked up person.
Well, let's talk about that, actually, because I know both of our other panelists have a lot to say about the connection between cannabis and other entheogens, and spirituality, and specifically the place of cannabis amongst other entheogenic drugs, practice of health and spirituality. Salimeh, would you like to take a stab at it?
Yeah, for sure. So it's interesting, because as Sunil kind of started off, cannabis has been an opener, and I always think this plant is so generous and so kind, because it almost took all of the the hardship and all the negative impact for 100-year prohibition, and then suddenly once cannabis kind of opened up, then all of the entheogens are kind of coming through now. The fungi are coming through and ayahuasca is coming through. So I really honor cannabis for being that first one that opened us up. And I can speak to the Santo Daime traditions, for example, that come out of Brazil. So in the Santo Daime traditions, the founders of Santo Daime were just rubber tappers, very simple people that connected with the indigenous who were stewards of the ayahuasca medicine, and they incorporated ayahuasca medicine into the Christian structure that was in Brazil, just so that they could bring the medicine out of the jungle and into some sort of, spiritual practice. And so it's beautiful to kind of see how cannabis fits into that as well. So in the Santo Daime tradition, they call ayahuasca the Daime, so the Daime saint, and they call cannabis Santa Maria, which is Saint Mary. And they see ayahuasca as more of the masculine energy, and they see cannabis as the more feminine energy. And oftentimes cannabis is brought into the ayahuasca ceremonies as a way to deepen the journey or allow people to get through the harder parts of the journey. Or thirdly, to land back into the 3D with more relaxation after
I'm very familiar with that process. Yes.
Perfect. Yes. So the landing and the grounding, the peace, the relaxation that cannabis oftentimes induces is so supportive. And so again, this is not all Santo Daime traditions and lineages have the two sacraments. Oftentimes, a lot of them are one sacrament oriented, but some of them do, especially under Padrino Sebastião's lineage. Santa Maria was brought in. So, when we look at the history of cannabis, and now, they found actual cannabis matter on altars in Israel. This was a huge discovery that happened this year, and I would welcome people to look at Chris Bennett's work. Sunil is a good friend of Chris's as well, and he's talked about a lot of these religions really linking back to cannabis, and we can talk about the yogic traditions and the sutras. But
let's talk about them.
Yeah, so of course in the Hindu religions, and Sunil can touch upon this as well because he's studied it much deeper than I have. But in the Hindu traditions, the Lord Shiva is also the Lord of Ganja, right? And in the yogic traditions, in some of their ancient texts, they talk about how yoga and cannabis have very much been parallel. And the yogis have used cannabis to be able to, again, come back into that place of practice, stillness, and to access enlightenment through their meditations, through the movement meditations. And so if we look at Judaism, if we look at Christianity, if we look at, the ancient, before, even prior to Hinduism, if we look at the Daime traditions, there's so much, the Egyptians, there's so much evidence now of cannabis, Santa Maria, as being a foundational piece into the growth of these religions. And so it's just so exciting that we're coming full circle now to this place where we now have full empowerment to use this medicine in the way that we want, whether it's in Sacred Circle or whether it's in our own creation of Sacred Circle or just within ourselves. And the basis of this is connection.
Fantastic. Well, Sunil, you've got two subjects as options now. You could discuss the entheogens in cannabis, and you could also throw a little history at us as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I want to say a little bit about the entheogenic framing, because it touches on the justice issues that Hempfest is certainly focused on as a protest rival. I'm very amazed at how we've allowed our country, our laws, to decide which types of religions and religious practices are valid and legitimate, and which forms of religious practices are illegitimate. When it comes to these entheogenic substances, we've allowed a certain kind of carve-outs, the different congressional laws, Supreme Courts, international treaties. There's all this kind of framework around what constitutes whose sacraments should we acknowledge and whose sacraments should we ignore? And I kind of try to think about this in a broader frame of like exemptions from the rules of public health, because technically all these drug laws are supposed to be to protect our health. We say cannabis is Schedule 1 in the U.S. and in these treaties because it's not good for our health. It's high potential, we'll abuse it, and it's not safe, and all that stuff. But if you, and the same thing is true with ayahuasca, actually, DMT is considered to be high potential for abuse and no accepted use. But if you are a member of the Santo Daime sect, or if you're a member of Unio de Vegetal, then your exemption. Then for you, it's the religious right trumps the public health or a fear of harm. The same thing happens in like Amish people. They don't have to sign up for Medicare. Everyone has to sign up for Medicare and the Affordable Care Act. Like we have these universal programs, but the Amish people, we respect their right to kind of not turn on the light, the electricity, like to associate with certain structures of society. That's their way of being in the world, and to get closer to like the bureaucracy of Medicare, like takes them away from their idea of what's divine, what's important, what's holy to them. And if you're Jehovah's Witness, you don't have to, take required blood transfusions, things like that. And really, I think this is like we're so arbitrary when it comes to these little carve-outs, and especially when you start to think about how universal spirituality is and entheogens are from around the world. Like, why do we just sort of choose certain groups? Oh, you have a certain. Of course, the Native American Church was founded in the early 20th century in a place called El Reno, Oklahoma, with the help of a Western anthropologist who joined with some of the tribes down there. And they said, we're going to found this church to protect the use of peyote, which is mescaline-containing cactus, because there was repeated raids on the tribal lands and the reservations by the federal government in the 19th century, early 20th century, to kind of shut this down, because they considered it like taking them away from the Christianization, the colonial project of getting indigenous people in North America to worship a certain god, to work a certain way, to give up their traditions, to give up their language, to give up their to go to certain boarding schools. And so there was this attempt to kind of push back. No, we're going to form this church. But I think that is still the law today. It's 1994. We have this law that just exempts people in the Native American Church to use peyote. And then the final example I give is Christians and wine. Every day, every Sunday, and every Christian church, many of them, they don't have to follow any liquor license laws, any safe use around schools when they serve alcoholic drinks to people who are under the age of consent, 21 years old, which can get people otherwise in a lot of trouble if you try to buy alcohol, at the gas station. If you're not 21, those people can be fined a lot of money. Sometimes those things happen, and it's just an ongoing thing. But because of the spirituality of Christianity, we say no. They don't have to deal with all those ridiculous laws, because for them the spirituality is more important. Their connection with alcohol as part of the Eucharist, the sacrament, to connect themselves to the higher consciousness, higher being. So all of that is to say, I wanted to say that cannabis falls into that family firmly, squarely, because of all the the traditions that Salimeh was mentioning around Asia and China, and many African spiritualities as well, and South American traditions that Salimeh was referring to, and it goes on, and of course, not just religions that are old, but religions that are new too. There's no rule that says that you can only practice a religion that is, has to be hundreds of years old. The idea that religions were just created thousands of years ago and they never get created again, or any kind of spiritual practices, is really kind of another thing that is shocking to me. And that's why the spiritual health concept kind of gets it out of that whole framework of religion and institutions and says everybody has a spiritual health compass. It doesn't matter what religion you are, if you have no religion or whatever. It's not tied to that. And So anyway, that's kind of my shtick about that. I should mention other countries have recognized cannabis as a spiritual, as an entheogen, like South Africa, Jamaica, and India. The laws are is recognized as a spiritual substance, or an entheogen. So, okay, the next thing I want to talk about with regards to that is a little bit about why is it, why with the whole medical cannabis movement, the big thing that's happened, of course, is CBD. And I think that really changed a lot of people's perceptions about cannabis, the value of CBD to heal children with seizure disorders, things like that, non-psychoactive parts of cannabis having these medicinal properties, which is very wonderful and very important. But if we don't, I'm worried about that sort of losing the value of it as an entheogen. And what's interesting is there's a lot of public health data that suggests that using THC cannabis actually, and the population level, has these big impacts on rates of cancer and heart disease and diabetes and obesity, numerous major indicators, suicide rates. All of these things are shift when THC containing cannabis is also part of the social systems. And so it's important to focus on that. And that's part of why I've come to this topic, because I don't think we can kind of get all of cannabis's value for ourselves and society if we don't acknowledge its spiritual dimension. The last thing I want to mention is why is it that spirituality is such an important part of health? This is something that Monte was referring to earlier. We are all destined to die. We have mortality is built into the human condition. Dominic mentioned the word existential. So there's an existential reality around our lives and our deaths, and I think that's a part of a daily. That's a stress. It can be a joyous stress. People embrace death, and some people, really afraid of death. And of course, when we are at risk of getting hurt, violence, or there's a pandemic or something around, we naturally protect ourselves. We want to live longer, and so it's built into our mode to go into a defensive mode to protect ourselves from death when it does happen. So you can't constantly live in fear of death. Otherwise, you wouldn't really be able to get into that growth phase that Salimeh was talking about, the parasympathetic, the resting, digesting, or the endocannabinoid system has been talked about as relaxing, feeding, protecting, and forgetting. You kind of get into that mode that helps you relax and eat and protect your health, protect your brain, and just forget things that you don't need to remember, so you can be present. So that's kind of, I think, the spiritual dimension is a way in which is necessary for health, because if we don't have that basis of sort of something greater or something meaningful, we'll constantly be in a state of not being aware, kind of tuned into death and not able to thrive. So I think it's tied into, in a very fundamental way, the nature of of what it means to be alive. And many times, if you don't take care of that spiritual dimension, you'll get physical health symptoms. We see this in palliative care a lot. People get a lot of pain at the end of life, or a lot of anxiety and pain, and then their gut stops working as well. And sometimes the issue is at a spiritual level, not coming to terms with something. So that's why that's kind of that's the story I wanted to share with everybody here. And I forgot to mention one thing. Timothy Leary was mentioned earlier too. He actually went to the Supreme Court in 1969 and testified that he was actually following the Hindu traditions of cannabis use when he was arrested for cannabis at the Mexico border. And he brought up a religious necessity defense to the Supreme Court. They actually ruled in his favor, but not for that reason. They ruled in his favor because of a technicality on.
Right, they didn't rule in his favor because of the religious thing.
Right. But he brought that up. Like, that was his defense, and I think it was the first time that this issue of cannabis as an entheogen was raised at the Supreme Court level, and I think it's it's very interesting to me. That's all.
Yeah. So, where does fear of social death fit into the spirituality picture, and how does cannabis help with that? And I also want you guys to all take a stab at this, but also you can ask each other questions now.
Okay. I smoked too much and I forgot the question.
How does cannabis help manage the fear of social death? The fear of being alone, I think.
Well, part of me has always believed that we die alone with our beliefs and with God or our spirit, no matter who's with us. And part of gaining spiritual awareness is accepting death. You've got to. If you're going to live, you got to accept death. And that is a big step in one's growth. And I've seen back in the day when people were dropping like flies from AIDS, and Shanti was training people to be companions. And a lot of people signed up to deal with their own issues around death. And so it was a help on both sides.
What role did cannabis play in that?
Cannabis is always a lubricant, can be a lubricant. It's a calming effect. And back then, cannabis, even as medicine, was illegal. And so sharing it and providing it could have serious consequences.
And this is something that's worth talking about right there. The serious consequences are jail, incarceration. And I know you have a panel on incarceration at Hempfest too this year, which is awesome, and everyone should also check that out too. But what is that? So that's a threat. When you're in jail, if you get isolated, right? That's a literal social death, or a form of it. You're removed from your community, from your friends, from your freedom, and then you're in a cage for most of the day
with a lot of other people.
Right, that's true. There is but I mean, when you're out of it, you kind of don't want to. So did cannabis help you deal with the threat of being jailed?
For me, no, it didn't. It increased paranoia. And before our first bust, I told my partner if he got busted, I was going to leave him. And then when he got busted, it's like, hey, I can't leave you now. I'm here to support you. And, cannabis was healing that relationship with Mark and myself. Definitely so. The unintended consequences. I think of cannabis as a gateway drug. I mean, if I look at youth, what's the first drug they're going to try? Not cigarettes anymore. Alcohol's hard to get. What's the easiest one to get? Cannabis. And that's where they start out. And, fortunately, it's not cocaine or heroin. It's an entheogen, whether they realize it or not. And so it helps start them on a path that they might have taken a lot longer to get to.
Dominic finds that really funny.
I do. I'm sorry. It's a gateway drug after all.
I mean, Clint Werner has a gateway calls it marijuana gateway to health. What is it a gateway to?
Yeah, sure. There you go. Yeah. No, I hear you. Very interesting. You mean that in a positive way, obviously.
Yes.
And I take it as such. So, cannabis and loneliness. How to fight loneliness.
Well, I want to give us. Okay, after I'll speak after Salimeh.
Yeah, sure. So just last night, I was talking to one of my clients, and he recently has been incarcerated in another country, tortured, come back, marriage falls apart, um, you know, job security is completely out. He has tons of his post-traumatic stress, paranoia, bipolar tendencies. And he told me that, and he's been healing for several months now, but when we go through a crisis like this, oftentimes all of the traumas from the first years of our life come to the surface as well. So it's like a huge spiritual opening if we're able to have the support for it. Otherwise, it can be a very, very dark night of the soul without support. So he was telling me that he had gone out with friends, and he was just walking in the city, and he had some cannabis. And what happens, which oftentimes happens with entheogens, is that his loneliness got amplified, right?
Yeah.
Well, in the amplification of his loneliness and the traumas, the memories starting to come back, he just decided that he was going to lean in. So with the help, right, with the support, I really do feel that these entheogens, especially cannabis, are life rafts for us during this time when many of us are drowning and trying to kind of keep our head above the water. So he leaned into his humanness, and he was able to just be with the fear in that moment and start to self-source, because this thing about our disconnection, and so much of the spiritual practices talk about this, that we are not disconnected. We are a massive energy field that has come into this physical form, and our whole experience in this life is to clear out any blocks to then reconnect to that source energy while we're still in this so-called separation. So if we are able to just get that, then our whole practice becomes that. And I just love that even within his trauma, with the help of cannabis, he was able to connect in and embrace loneliness and move through it, through the body, and then have peace. Yeah, so that was one example. And I shared this actually with you guys last time we had a chance to talk. For me, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as many people know, is based on safety and shelter and food at the basis of it, and then you move up through emotional connection, and then at the very top is self-actualization, so connection to the spiritual realms. But for me, that is completely reverted now. And so at the basis of it, and when I work with my clients, first question first is, what is your spiritual practice? How do you find yourself connected to nature? Are you in balance, not only in your body, but in your spiritual practice, in your emotions? And we build the spiritual foundation first, and then they can get up and think, maybe I want to put something healthy into my body. Then they get up and think, okay, maybe I have anxiety and I'm going to take some herbs for it, including cannabis. Then they start to think, okay, well, how did I engage with that person in my life? And can I change that? But without that spiritual foundation, everything else seems to be a bit of a wreck. I find, and I found in my life and in my clients' lives. So I feel that these plants, again, are rafts in this massive ocean that we're in now.
Oh man, Salimeh, it's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing those stories about your clients and how you approach care. I grew up in this buckle of the Bible Belt in Oklahoma, and in a lot of parts of this country, we had this huge moral majority and kind of a religious war. It still goes on to this day, and in which certain forms of religion are used as cudgels to diminish other people. They're in, they're out, they're chosen, they're not chosen, and so it's really sad how religion and spirituality kind of tied into that, sort of gets distorted at a larger, at a level that's, really takes us away from its potential as a secular. Well, this is not, tied to any religion. This is just tied to, like, what is the term that we have for, being alive. Existential spirituality is so key. And I just love how you, like, that's going to be a foundation piece, and I think that's another theme, I think, of this. I wanted to title this thing "Public Spiritual Health," because we talk about public mental health, talk about public health. Really, oftentimes is physical health. How do you get that virus particle off of you? How do you make sure your sewage is away from where your food sources are? How do you make sure your air is clean? I mean, it's very important. Physical health is very important, of course, but so is mental health, and so is spiritual health. And so, what does it mean to, like, come up with a public health system that's integrated? And I just love how and it's like they're not like one stacks on another. They're all very critical, and in some ways, the spiritual health is the top or the bottom, because if you don't have a sense of meaning and purpose, that's why all this diseases of despair. They're talking about the deaths of despair now in the United States with opioid overdoses and suicides, and so many some addiction, so many things are I think tied to a spiritual distress, deep distress that is there. So the other thing I wanted to say is about existential distress around social exclusion. And I take like a evolutionary psychology view to this. And there's a lot of amazing work now coming out about Homo sapiens and our origins and what it was like. And this stuff is like still in our genes, What was it like to be a hunter-gatherer, which was all of our ancestors? And, if you did not stay with the group, if you got socially excluded for some reason, what would it be like to your survival? If you don't have access to the group who helps you with fending off predators. What's that?
Die.
You die, exactly. You die. There's no food. There's no safety. There's no protection. There's no shelter. You can't do it all yourself on the savannah or the plains or wherever the bands of our ancestors were. Extremely dependent. Your survival depended upon your tribe. Maybe you could go away for a little while, but you always have to come back for all your basic needs. And so when you were excluded, and of course there were, punishments and things like, I'm sure there's systems where people were excluded, it was essentially a death sentence. And so I think that's part of the deep level at which existential threats to, social deaths that you mentioned, Dominic, really can be interpreted essentially as, feeling like you're going to actually die. And I think that's, and no amount of, post-capitalist consumerism, we're really good if we just get this nice new watch or this new phone or this new gadget, you're going to be smiling like the people in the, the screen share here. Hi, Debbie.
What's going on there, Debbie?
It's perfect. I love that. So sweet.
Yeah, that's a lovely dog. I love your picture there. Anyway, I was just wanting to share that. I think that, and what's interesting is that there's actually research that's been done by psychologists that shows the endocannabinoid system is involved in helping us deal with exclusion. They actually set up these psychology experiments where they have people playing like a game, and then you kind of get kicked off the team, so to speak. Somebody randomly just boots you off the game, boots you off the island. You're not chosen for the next round. And it turns out people who took a drug beforehand that kind of boosts the endocannabinoid system, they don't feel as bad about, like, hey, I was playing this game with real virtual game with all these people, and then they just kicked me out like I was nothing. Like if you ask them, do you feel really bad about that, about yourself? If you took the drug, and it wasn't, believe it or not, the drug is actually acetaminophen, Tylenol. Tylenol boosts the endocannabinoid system in these subtle ways. You actually don't feel as bad. So people have used cannabis for a long time in this way to kind of deal with rejection and social isolation. I think it's kind of one of these salves. And I think also the indigenous, or the use in enslaved populations and indentured servants in the Caribbean, like Indian immigrants who came over to work the sugarcane plantations in Jamaica, which is where Rastafarianism began, also another religion where cannabis is is revered. I think that was part of what cannabis was for them. If you're treated like a beast of burden, and all your worth is like tied up to like how much sugar cane you can cut, and that's about it. You don't have land, you don't have title, you can't vote, you don't have anything. I think that's part of why I think cannabis was used to sort of palliate that sense of social rejection.
I know we're running, I think, pretty close on time. So I want to allow everyone one last thing to say. You could ask each other something right now, however you want to do it. But this will be the last go around. Final thoughts, Monty?
I would urge anyone that's watching and listening to this to take heed of what's been discussed and realize that cannabis is a spiritual experience. And, it can be, so many people start it as a party thing. And maybe it's time to realize it's greater growth. So that's it.
Thank you, Monty. We'll take questions after you guys have your final thoughts.
Yeah.
Salimeh?
I can jump in. So yeah, one of the main reasons why I felt called to start the Cannabis Hemp Conference was that I had a meditation with the spirit of cannabis that came through, and in that meditation, it was a female energy, and she said that she was tired of being abused, misused, misunderstood, and prostituted. And so it's such an amazing time again for us to come and be in reverence again with cannabis after all these years of prostitution, prohibition, right? And it's still happening on a corporate level. And to really honor this medicine and respect this medicine, because these medicines, all the entheogens, are just part of our earth. And right now, more than ever, we need to come into respect and harmony with our planet, because we're just about to go into the bottleneck of the ceremony. It's we can't deny the fact that we are, like David Suzuki says, we are a car heading towards a brick wall, and nobody's pulling the brake. And so our, the next 2-3 years, as far as climate change, climate refugees, water security, food security, all of these things are right in front of us. And the anxiety is just going to grow on the planet in this regard. And so what do we have access to? And it's going to go back into more of the tribal, my sense is more of the tribal ways of being. And like Sunil was saying, how do you survive in a tribe? There has to be a glue. And usually spirituality is the glue. And I think in our times, the medicines are the glue. And cannabis is a major glue, not only just for the gathering, the connection of sitting together around the fire, the sacred fire, the first one that we burn, but also in the fact of food security, of growing hemp, structural security, toxins, right? Clearing out the toxins of our environment. All these things are spirituality, because if we don't have these things, we're not going to live. And again, in another ceremony I had with ayahuasca, she said, enlightenment is survival and survival is enlightenment. So really those who come into that place of presence, of unity with each other, with themselves, are going to potentially make it through this time. And so it's just incredible how fortunate we are. I think the people who are sitting on this panel, individuals, wonderful people who have put on Hempfest for 29 years, and everyone who's watching this and in the cannabis community, we are stewards. So it's so special that we have access to this medicine, and let's use it to heal ourselves and to support the healing of others.
That's so beautiful. I just want to thank you all for being here on this panel, and everyone listening, spending your time, Dominic, for moderating us, and Yvonne and Ami for helping us organize this, and course, to Vivian and all the Hempfest core team this year, and of course all the years in the past who've kept this going despite all the odds. And I just really want to give great gratitude and thank you. I want to just say two things. One thing I didn't get a chance to say is about the importance of what I think has sometimes been called the divine feminine archetype. Something having to do with the and Sally mentioned earlier, like some spiritual traditions treat cannabis as the feminine, Santa Maria, a feminine essence or energy. I think there's some great folks out there who've talked about a lot of our entire suppression game against cannabis and other entheogens came from a very male-dominated, system of spiritual control. And there's a new book out called The Immortality Key, which is amazing. This Brian Marascu has written, which talks about, the ancient religion of dying before you die, and how that really was a big deal throughout, the prehistory and early Christianity. But then it got warped and turned into, it was suppressed, the witch hunts and the pushing out of heresy. And the main thing was like no women allowed, in the spiritual echelons, the higher echelons, whereas women were the ones that were carrying and holding the medicine in the early Christian church and the early traditions, the Dionysian rituals, all the famous rituals that involve probably entheogenic substances for communing. And so I think there's something to be said for making space for that view, that consciousness of the divine feminine, the mother, that connection, which will bring us back to the plants. Cannabis's female plant form is the one that provides us this medicine that we're talking about.
And the land is dark.